Israel will accept Jesus as their Messiah. What if I told you that a 2,500-year-old prophecy is unfolding right before our eyes, and that when it's complete, it will trigger the most dramatic spiritual awakening in human history? You will be shocked when you find out the 3 events that must happen first. The first event is already underway. And the third event? Well, when it happens, it will be unmistakable. Sign number 1. Israel becomes a cup of trembling. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling to all the surrounding peoples when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. This is Zechariah 12, verses 1 and 2. And it's being fulfilled in real time, right before our eyes. May 14th, 1948. David Ben-Gurion stands in a small museum in Tel Aviv and reads 17 sentences that change history forever. We hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel to be known as the State of Israel. 11 hours later, 5 Arab armies attack. But something impossible happened. The tiny nation not only survived, they won. And that was just the beginning. Because what Zechariah saw wasn't just one conflict. He saw a pattern that would repeat for decades, creating what the prophecy calls a cup of trembling. In ancient Middle Eastern culture, when someone was forced to drink from a cup of trembling, it meant they were being made to consume something that would make them irrational, unstable, unable to think clearly. But here's what makes the cup of trembling prophecy truly remarkable. It's not just about military victories. It's about the irrational obsession that the world has developed with this tiny nation. Israel is smaller than New Jersey. It has 0.1% of the world's landmass and 0.2% of the world's population. Yet the United Nations has passed more resolutions condemning Israel than all other nations combined. Think about that for a moment. More UN condemnations than North Korea's nuclear program. Why? Why does a nation smaller than most American states generate more international controversy than countries with actual human rights disasters? Because they're drinking from the cup of trembling. However, the obsession extends beyond politics. It affects how nations think, how they vote, how they make decisions that often harm their own interests. But here's what's truly remarkable about this prophecy. Zechariah didn't just predict that surrounding nations would oppose Israel. He predicted they would lay siege against Jerusalem specifically. And in the 21st century, that's exactly what we're seeing. But Zechariah saw something else about this siege. He saw that it wouldn't succeed. In fact, he saw that it would ultimately lead to the destruction of Israel's enemies. Which brings us to the second prophetic sign. And this one is accelerating faster than most people realize. Sign number 2. Jerusalem's enemies to be destroyed. And it shall happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it. In that day I will strike every horse with confusion, and its rider with madness. I will open my eyes on the house of Judah, and will strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. This is Zechariah 12, verses 3 through 7. And notice something crucial about this prophecy. Jerusalem isn't just going to be attacked, it's going to become a burdensome stone that injures everyone who tries to move it. But what does it mean for Jerusalem to become a burdensome stone? And why does everyone who tries to heave it away end up being cut in pieces? Because Zechariah didn't just predict that Israel's enemies would be defeated. He predicted how they would be defeated and what it would look like when it happened. For the first time since Israel became a nation, we're seeing the exact coalition that Ezekiel prophesied 2,600 years ago starting to form. Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And according to both Zechariah and Ezekiel, when this coalition finally attacks Israel, something will happen that will shock the world. God Himself will intervene. In that day, I will strike every horse with confusion, and its rider with madness. I will open my eyes on the house of Judah, and will strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. Horses in biblical prophecy often represent military might. So what does it mean for God to strike every horse with confusion, and its rider with madness? It means that Israel's enemies will become their own worst enemies. Their military plans will backfire. Their strategies will be confused. Their leadership will make irrational decisions that lead to their own destruction. And we're already seeing this pattern begin. But according to Zechariah, this is just the beginning. Because when God finishes dealing with Israel's enemies, something will happen that will transform not just Israel, but the entire world. The third and the sign that will end 2,000 years of Jewish rejection and begin the greatest spiritual awakening in human history. But to understand this final sign, you need to understand something that most Christians miss about God's plan for Israel. God isn't just protecting Israel for political reasons. He's protecting them for a spiritual purpose that He revealed to Zechariah in the most important prophecy in the entire Old Testament. Sign number 3, the Spirit of grace and supplication. And I will pour on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the Spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look on me whom they pierced. Yes, they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. This is Zechariah 12 verse 10, and it describes the most dramatic moment in human history since the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Picture this scene with me. Millions of Jewish people, simultaneously, around the world, suddenly understanding that the man their ancestors crucified 2,000 years ago was actually their Messiah. The realization hits like lightning. The grief is overwhelming, but so is the joy. Because this isn't just individual Jews converting to Christianity. This is the entire nation of Israel recognizing their Messiah as a nation. But how does this happen? What triggers this supernatural recognition? Notice the order in Zechariah's prophecy. First, God pours out the Spirit of grace and supplication. Then they look on Him whom they pierced. The spiritual revelation comes before the recognition. This means that Israel's recognition of Jesus won't come through human evangelism or political pressure. It will come through direct divine intervention. And according to the biblical timeline, this intervention happens after Israel's enemies are defeated and the nation realizes that their survival was supernatural. Think about the progression. First, Israel becomes a cup of trembling. Check. Second, their enemies are gathered and destroyed. In progress. Third, they recognize that their repeated survival was not because of their military might, but because God was protecting them for a purpose. And that's when the third sign kicks in. Then they will look on me whom they pierced. The Hebrew word for look here doesn't mean a casual glance. It means to look intently, to perceive, to understand. It's the same word used when someone finally grasps a truth that had been hidden from them. This is supernatural revelation. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, scales fall from millions of eyes simultaneously. But here's what makes this prophecy even more remarkable. Zechariah was writing 500 years before Jesus was born. How could he know that the Messiah would be pierced? Piercing wasn't even a Jewish form of execution. Jews stoned people to death. But when the Romans crucified Jesus, they pierced his hands, his feet, and his side with a spear. And the Apostle John, writing his Gospel 60 years later, specifically quoted Zechariah 12:10 to show that even the manner of Jesus' death was prophetically predicted. Which means that when Jewish people see Jesus after this spiritual outpouring, they won't just see him as a teacher or a prophet. They'll see his wounds. They'll see the nail marks. They'll see the spear wound. And they'll realize that every Passover they celebrated, every sacrifice they offered, every prophecy they studied was pointing to him. But this recognition doesn't just affect Israel. According to the Apostle Paul, it triggers something that affects the entire world. Now, if their fall is riches for the world, how much more their fullness? For if their being cast away is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? When Israel fell into unbelief, it opened the door for Gentiles to be saved. When Israel comes back to faith, it will trigger the greatest revival in human history. But when will this happen? How close are we to this moment? There are signs that suggest we may be closer than most people think. For the first time since 70 AD, there are more Jews living in Israel than in any other country in the world. For the first time in 2,000 years, Israel controls Jerusalem. For the first time since the Roman destruction, there are serious plans to rebuild the temple. And for the first time in modern history, we're seeing the exact geopolitical alignment that Ezekiel and Zechariah predicted. But perhaps most significantly, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of Jewish people coming to faith in Jesus as their Messiah. In 1948, when Israel became a nation, there were fewer than 4,000 Jewish believers in Jesus worldwide. Today, there are over 350,000. That's nearly a 9,000% increase in 75 years. Something is stirring. Something is changing. The spiritual climate in Israel is shifting in ways that suggest God may be beginning to pour out the spirit of grace and supplication. But according to biblical prophecy, when this outpouring happens, it won't just affect Israel. It will affect the entire world in ways that will change everything. Why hasn't Israel accepted Jesus as the Messiah? They had the scriptures. They had the signs. They had the miracles. They even had him in the flesh. So why, after 2,000 years, is Israel still waiting for someone who already came? And is there something bigger happening behind the scenes? There are 5 reasons Israel hasn't accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Reason number 1, they expected a political Messiah. Let's go back to the 1st century. Israel was under Roman control. They paid taxes to Caesar. They saw Roman soldiers walking their streets. They heard foreign languages in their marketplaces. They were waiting for rescue. And every day, they prayed for the same thing. God, send us a king, a warrior, a deliverer. Someone like Moses, who would confront their enemy. Someone like David, who would slay giants and rule from Jerusalem again. So when Jesus showed up, humble, born in a stable, preaching, "Blessed are the meek," they were confused. This isn't what they expected. They thought the Messiah would sit on a throne, not hang on a cross. They were looking for a lion, but he came as a lamb. And even though Jesus fulfilled the scriptures, he didn't fulfill their expectations. They weren't wrong about the Messiah being a king. They were just too early. The crown comes after the cross. They wanted victory. He brought sacrifice. They wanted revenge. He brought mercy. They turned on him. They shouted, "Hosanna," one day, and "Crucify him," just days later. Because Jesus came to conquer sin, not Caesar. And that's what they didn't understand. What if they had accepted the suffering Messiah? Would they have been ready for his return as king? First, he comes to serve. Then, he returns to reign. One Messiah. Two comings. When you expect Jesus to fit your plans, you may miss the one who came to change your heart. Reason number 2. A hardened heart was prophesied. Let's slow down right here, because this reason might be the most misunderstood of them all. Israel didn't just reject Jesus because of politics or pride. It was part of prophecy. Yes, you heard that right. God allowed Israel's heart to be hardened for a time. God hath given them the spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear. Romans 11:8. This wasn't random. This wasn't accidental. It was intentional. That's the mystery Paul talks about in Romans 11. God was weaving a bigger plan than anyone could see. What looked like rejection was actually redirection. Why would God allow His chosen people to be blind? What kind of plan lets unbelief become the door to salvation for the world? Here's the truth. If Israel had received Jesus in the beginning, the gospel might have stayed in Israel. But because they rejected Him, the message spread like wildfire across the earth, to Africa, to Asia, to Europe, to the Americas. Their fall opened the door. Their blindness gave others sight. But it won't stay that way forever. And that's the powerful twist. Their blindness is temporary. God didn't throw them away. He said, "Blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in." Romans 11, verse 25. That means one day the veil will lift, the eyes will open, the hearts will soften, and Israel will look up and recognize the one they pierced. The same people who cried, "Crucify him," will one day cry, "Come, Lord Jesus." More Jews have come to faith in Jesus in the last 50 years than in the last 1,000 years combined. The hard heart is beginning to soften. If God fulfilled His promises to the Gentiles because of Israel's rejection, then you can be sure He will fulfill His promises to Israel when they return. God doesn't break His word. Reason number 3. Jesus didn't fit their expectations of holiness. Jesus ate with sinners. He touched lepers. He showed mercy to prostitutes. And He walked right past the religious elite to find the broken. That made people uncomfortable. They wanted a Messiah who looked holy on the outside. But Jesus was holy on the inside. And He exposed the emptiness of man-made righteousness. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Luke 5:32. They were waiting for perfection, but missed the only perfect one. Reason number 4. The cross was a stumbling block. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block. 1 Corinthians 1:23. In Jewish culture, being crucified meant being cursed. So how could the Messiah, God's chosen one, die that kind of death? They couldn't reconcile it. They didn't see the cross as power. They saw it as weakness. But what they called a curse, God called a cure. Crucifixion was considered so shameful in Jewish law that even being hung on a tree meant you were cursed. Deuteronomy 21:23. That's why the cross was hard for them to accept. Reason number 5. God's plan isn't finished yet. God's plan isn't finished. The rejection of Jesus wasn't the end of Israel's story. It was part of a prophecy that's still unfolding. For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, that blindness in part is happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Romans 11:25. Did you catch that? The blindness is partial, and it has an expiration date. God is not done with Israel. He never has been. Something dramatic will happen. God will turn His full attention back to Israel, and the veil, the spiritual blindness over their eyes, will be lifted. And so all Israel shall be saved. As it is written, "There shall come out of Zion the deliverer." Romans 11:26. Right now, thousands of Jewish people around the world are already coming to faith in Jesus, Yeshua, in small but powerful numbers. These are Messianic Jews, believers who are rediscovering their own scriptures and seeing the truth leap off the page. Isaiah 53 is opening eyes. Psalm 22 is piercing hearts. And they're realizing Jesus is the promised one. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Isaiah 53 verse 5. Isaiah 53 is often skipped over in traditional synagogue readings. Some call it the forbidden chapter because of how clearly it points to Jesus. But now, Jews are reading it online, on YouTube, in Hebrew, and finding their Messiah hidden in plain sight. First, blindness, then conviction, then national awakening. This final turn back to Jesus will not just be personal, it will be national. One day, Israel will lead the world in worship. One day, Jerusalem will be the city where Jesus reigns. One day, they will not reject Him. They will crown Him. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Isaiah 2:3. You're not watching a nation that's lost. You're watching a prophecy in motion. Israel's silence today is the setup for the loudest declaration of faith the world has ever seen. And when that moment happens, the world will know. The trumpet will sound. The King will return. And Israel will finally say, "He is ours." So why hasn't Israel accepted Jesus yet? Because God is writing a story bigger than one moment. It started in Genesis. It flowed through Moses, David, the prophets. It reached its climax at the cross. And it will find its fulfillment when Israel opens its eyes, lifts its hands, and welcomes Jesus, not as a stranger, but as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. For 2,000 years, many people have dismissed Christianity as a Gentile religion that the Jews themselves rejected. If Jesus was really the Jewish Messiah, they argue, why don't the Jews believe in Him? When that argument disappears, when the Jewish people themselves proclaim Jesus as their Messiah, it will remove one of the biggest barriers to faith that has existed for centuries. But there's something else that happens when Israel recognizes their Messiah, something that Jesus Himself predicted. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Jesus spoke these words to Jerusalem in Matthew 23:39. He was telling them that His return was connected to their recognition of Him, which means that Israel's acceptance of Jesus as Messiah is directly connected to the second coming of Christ. But that raises a crucial question about timing. If we're seeing the first two signs fulfilled, and if the third sign triggers the return of Christ, how close are we to the end of this age? The answer depends on how quickly the current Middle East situation develops. Right now, we're watching the second sign, the gathering and destruction of Israel's enemies, accelerating rapidly. Because it's one thing for Israel to survive against impossible odds through superior military strategy. It's another thing entirely for them to survive through obvious divine intervention. And when Israeli Jews realize that their survival was not due to their own strength, but to God's protection, their hearts will be prepared for the spirit of grace and supplication. But there's something else happening right now that suggests we may be closer to these events than most people realize. The answer lies in the unprecedented convergence of prophetic signs that we're witnessing right now. For the first time in 2,000 years, the Jewish people are back in their ancient homeland. For the first time since 70 AD, they control Jerusalem.
Many seem to be confused because they do not understand the book of Revelation. However, what if there was an animation showing the entire book? Well, we created that. And to watch that, click here.